I interviewed Marjorie, who is an 86-year-old white woman. Date is November 22nd, 1935. I decided to use developmental stage 6 of Ericksen's biopsychosocial theory of development, which is the stage of intimacy versus isolation. As I looked at this stage, completing each of the previous stages in Eric's theory, it has been said that if you don't complete each one, then there'll be problems as you go into each of the next stages. As I look at Marjorie's development in her childhood, some of those stages were not completed, and yet the ending of her psychosocial crisis has a much better outcome. I'm hoping that I'll be able to show you where some of his other theory thoughts, as well as some other ideas, come into play in helping her still be able to resolve her her psychosocial crisis. This is a time when relationships are being worked on, relationships that people often are hoping are going to be lifelong relationships, and it doesn't always work out that way. So, and it wasn't any different in Marjorie's case. Uh, Marjorie struggles, first of all, with establishing a relationship with her first husband. She became pregnant at the age of 16 and got married. Although she did finish her schooling, she gets married at this young age and immediately has 4 children. Now, she's not supporting herself. Her husband does work, but she is feeling this discontentment of depending on her own parents for the support. She came from a mid to upper socioeconomic class, and so her commitment to um, wanting to support her own family plays a part in her deciding to go get a job. Um, and as we look at some of the studies that have come out, it's this commitment, a commitment to, in particular, education, also just commitment to certain values of this source, uh, lead us to help with our identity development. The challenges that she faced was this was an era in which women without formal education, which even formal education wasn't, high on the roster for women at that point yet. But women were just beginning to break into the industry type jobs, and this was hard for her. I mean, she had 4 little girls, and she decides to get a job to help her current husband to support them. And uh, these these were big challenges because the jobs that were available to her were jobs like waitressing, cleaning. There weren't a lot of options for her at that point. The first challenge that she faced was getting pregnant at age 16, because that was in an era when parents oftentimes forced marriage. If you got pregnant, um, their their faith, their society beliefs, um, the cultural, things being carried over from before, um, would force them into marriage, which is what happened. her parents insisted that they get married. And then came three more children. If we look at the way in which the psychosocial crisis is resolved in Marjorie's life, we have to look at the resourceful self. And Erickson's Erickson has his own, uh, schedule of human strengths. Um, he had a tendency to feel that if it worked better in the interest of using this schedule by pairing them up. Um, the eight human strengths that Erickson mentions are hope, will, purpose, competence, fidelity, love, care, and wisdom. If we look at these in pairs, it's more it makes more sense. Hope and will. Marjorie hoped for a better future for herself as well as her children. Her commitment was to these four little girls that she had. She not only looked at the hope of that, but she had the will and the willpower to commit to making this happen regardless. She had a purpose and competence. In spite of a lot of challenges that come from her earlier stages in development, she formed a solid purpose. Her family was her purpose. As I interviewed her, what I think, and it probably was influenced by her era, her concentration was on her family, but at the same time, she had a lot of concentration on her own self, too. If we look at fidelity and love together, those play a part that I will mention later. Um, but those play a part in her development of her identity, of herself, not just this commitment she had to these girls. Care and wisdom are the other two strengths that Erickson's mentions in the human strengths, and he pairs those two up: care and wisdom. If When I look at Marjorie's life, she really cared about her family, and not only her family but her future. And she used a lot of wisdom in making some really wise choices over the next 10 years that really form her successful resolution to the psycho social crisis. Problems that were brought to my attention by Marjorie was the immorality of her dad, coupled with the fact that he was an alcoholic. Uh, So if we look at these two things, when I listen to her talk, uh, these things really formed her attitude about the infidelity of her dad or how seriously she looked at infidelity. It also helped her form her attitude towards being having alcoholism as a part of her life. Her father She witnessed her father hit her mother, but her attitude was, well, she never had to, she didn't have to go to the hospital or she didn't have to call 911, almost as if she had watched it enough. It was part of this was okay. It wasn't totally okay, but it wasn't, she did not qualify this as something horrible from her childhood. It was just how life was. Although, of course, she didn't feel safe. She hadn't developed a trust because she saw the blatant, immorality of her dad. And she also witnessed her mother just living with it. And it was okay. But again, this is during an era when women didn't have as many choices if they would have left, bad situations. They didn't have many choices. So she was not a woman of, had a college education. So the safest thing that she could do to remove herself from that first crisis was to get married. But as we look at her strengths and the things that became a resourceful strength for her, she drew a lot of those from non parental people in her life, from the societies in which she and her husband lived. And her involvement with another man in that society begins to show us how the formation of the attitude on fidelity allowed her to kind of slip into this second relationship and justify it. It started out as a friendship, but eventually this man becomes her second husband. And this goes right in there with this, the theory of development, where she struggles with her own attitude about infidelity. As I looked at Marjorie's non parental influences, her mother's side of the family were in positions of a higher socioeconomic status as well as educational backgrounds. And I feel these really, really, really are the things that gave her the strength to do what she did, to better herself, and to find herself in a position where she was supporting her family and she had a better husband. These the the grandparents on her mother's side had involvement with, first of all, there was no alcohol or smoking of any sort or anything, as far as chemical dependencies on that side, which of course would have allowed her to see, outside of her home, the influences of a more positive side to living. So she kind of got a balance of living in the violence and, infidelity of her father, and her mother just kind of taking it to um, the other side, where her grandparents, and she did spend a lot of time with her grandparents, and they would go out on trips and spend a lot of time together in a society and a community that did a lot of social work, and they had successful careers, and it really showed her a um, a much better side. So if we look at these social and non-parental influences, as well as the socioeconomic status, the educational backgrounds, uh, I feel that these all were part of where she drew her strength from. She drew her strength from these non-parental sources in order to continue to uh, work towards a betterment of not only her own life, but the life of her family and children. So at one point, she decides to go get a job. And of course, it was a waitressing job. And because they had four children, she said, she would work at night. So her husband could have the job during the day. And then the children, there wasn't a lot of childcare availability, not as much as there is now. And also, she felt that it was important, she was raised that it was important for the parents to take care of their children. So there they were. And as she gets a job, he decides he doesn't want to work. We have to remember these children, I mean, they are not even 20, they're barely 20. So he decides, well, since she's working, he doesn't need to work, he'll just take care of the children and she can work at night.